Welcome to my studio. Today's painting is of coneflowers and bees. My name's Elizabeth Bostick, and I am so happy to have you with me today to create this beautiful watercolor. For the paper today, I'm using 140-pound cold-pressed 100% cotton paper that's in this cute little sketchbook. I don't know how to pronounce the name of the manufacturer of the sketchbook, so I will add that in the text above. After drawing the initial sketch of the coneflowers, which you can find in the description of the video if you would like to trace and paint along, I used my kneaded eraser to lighten up the pencil lines, and then using my number 6 round watercolor brush, I put 8 dots of the magenta rose watercolor and then rinse out my brush, and using just water on the brush, make the shape of the petal, and the paint follows the water to create this beautiful wet on wet watercolor effect. I do that for each petal, rinsing out the brush. If the pink is getting a little bit too intense on the brush, you wash out your brush so it's just water on the brush again and go on to the next petal. You can go back in and play with the paint a little bit, adding a little bit more water or moving it around a little bit to get it how you would like it to be. And you can see that on the left-hand side of the sketchbook, I have my ceramic palette, and that is where I have my washes of watercolor that I will be using later on in the painting. For the next coneflower, I do the same thing. Rinse off your brush so you have just water on your watercolor brush, and then make the shape of the petal in water, and when that water hits the little dab of paint, the paint will flow into the water and make that really neat effect. The next step is for the interior, the cone of the coneflower, the center part of it. For that, I use a purple first, and here I'm making a lighter wash of the purple where I'm adding just a few brushfuls of water and a little bit of purple, mixing it up. So I start with dabs of the purple in both coneflowers, so this will be your first layer of color for the cone of the coneflowers. Some of the dabs touch the petals, and then you can see the color flowing into the color of the petals just a little bit, and I really like that effect. For the second layer of the cone and the coneflower, I'm using the same color as the petals, which is the magenta rose. And then after the magenta rose, I'm using a cadmium red, which is more of a brighter red, and that is the third layer of the cone. So now I have my red down, rinsing out my brush, and I'm going to be using the yellow, which is a cadmium deep yellow or a cadmium yellow light. Either one will work. And that is the final layer of the coneflowers. And this gives it a sunlit effect, as if the sun is shining on the flowers, and it gives it that glowing sunlit look. The yellow is touching the red in places, so you can see the colors blending together a bit, and I love that effect as well. For the third and fourth coneflowers, I'm doing them the same way, putting down 8 dots of color, rinsing off my brush, and then using the water to form the shape of the petals so that the paint flows into the water shape of the petals. And then the cones, I'm doing the same way, where you have first your purple, and then your magenta, then your red, and then your yellow for the center, for the cone of the coneflowers. On the top coneflower, you can see where the paint has dried and it made a little bit of a line where I didn't want it. And so what I'm doing is using just water on my brush softening up that line and then using a paper towel to soak some of that paint up and giving it a bit of a lighter look. The coneflowers that are still in the process of blooming, I'm using that same magenta rose color, and I'm making very thin petals, kind of in a basket shape, where you have some in the front, some on the side, some in the back, and I do the same thing for the next partially open coneflower. If you want to follow the outline that I did for these, I do have that in the description listed below. You can download it and then print it and trace it, or excuse me, or you can freehand it. Either way, I think it might look a little bit intimidating, but once you practice it a little bit, maybe on a scrap piece of paper, you'll get the hang of it in no time. It kind of reminds me of those hard plastic basket weaving projects maybe some of you had as a kid, where you go in and out of the spokes with the yarn. But it just happens to be the way these coneflowers look when they're partially blooming, and I thought they were a fun shape, so I wanted to add them. Next, for adding a little bit of interest to them, I'm using some quinacridone violet. It doesn't really matter what kind of violet you use, that's just the one I happen to have. And two of these partially bloomed coneflowers are still wet enough where you can see I'm charging the still wet color with that quinacridone violet, and it's blending nicely into it. But the third one on the top left-hand corner was too dry, so you can see more of a harder drying line. So for the stems, the color green that I'm using is a combination of emerald green and burnt sienna. I find this gives a rich botanical green that I really love. To figure out where your stems are going, or where they're going to go, where you need to paint them in, I like to use my brushes to kind of give a guideline and figure out what would look best. For this stem, I'm using the same combination of emerald green and burnt sienna. For the shadow right underneath the flower, to make it look like the sunshine is hitting the flower and there's a bit of shadow underneath it, I'm mixing ultramarine blue in with that green that I'd already mixed. That was the emerald green and the burnt sienna. If you don't have burnt sienna or emerald green, if you have a warm green, that will work, or even a cooler green would work for this as well. And then for your shadows, you can add a blue to that green and it will make a darker hue of green for you. So here I have added just a bit more to it, and then I've decided to take it away with a paper towel as it was just a little bit too dark. That is one nice thing about watercolor, is you can always, or you can usually, take away from the paint that you put down if you put too much down with a paper towel or a cloth. And right here, I'm taking some of the paint that I put down with the brush. If you dry off your brush, you can use it as a sponge and pick up some of the color with the brush that you've put down. For this next coneflower, I'm using that same combination of emerald green and burnt sienna, and then the mix of the turquoise blue, or sorry, the ultramarine blue with that green for the shadow. For this next stem, I'm putting down water first. You don't need to do that. I just happen to have a wet brush, and I was trying to figure out if that's really where I wanted the stem. So I laid down a line of water along the line first, and then added that same mixture of emerald green and burnt umber for the green, and then that same ultramarine blue at the very top to give it more depth, and then at the bottom of the stem as well. That way it looks like the sunlight is hitting the flowers, and there's a bit of shadow underneath the flowers and a bit of shadow towards the base of the stem as well. Then I'm adding more color to the coneflower stem that I've already done, as I'm wanting it to stand out a bit more and have a bit more weight in the foreground of the painting, and match the one next to it that's also in the foreground of the painting. For the partially bloomed coneflower to the top right part of the painting, I'm adding a little bit of violet to the inside of it as I'm playing with some shadow, perhaps trying to give it a little bit more interest to the painting. And then I'm putting in some red into that violet as well. Now that the coneflowers are complete, and I think they look gorgeous, I'm so happy with them, we are moving towards the bees. For the bees, I looked at pictures of those fluffy, adorable bumblebees. And to make the color yellow, I'm using a combination of yellows, but I think that the cadmium yellow light is pretty much the perfect yellow to use for these bees to start off with. So what I am doing is making 3 little puddles of yellow. It's a lot easier than it looks once you get the hang of it. I would practice it on a little scrap piece of paper first before putting it into your painting. I think this is probably like the 10th and 11th bee that I painted to practice for this. I did a little bit of experimentation first. So I make 3 puddles of yellow, the top being the thinnest, the middle being the fattest, and the little fuzzy bottom being a little bit smaller than the middle, but not as small as the head. For the second bee, I do it the same way, where the top puddle of yellow is the smallest. It's a bit thin. The middle is nice, round little fluffy ball, and then their little fuzzy bottom is a little bit smaller than the middle puddle of yellow. Once you have your 3 puddles of yellow, don't put them too far apart. Put them as close together or even closer than I have in my painting. You'll want to wait for it to completely dry before going in with, you can use a Payne's Gray, you can use a watered down black. You can make your own black by mixing maybe your purple and brown together. To make a black or a really dark color, you can mix a red, a blue, and a yellow together. For this one, I used the black that came with the set, which I watered down a little bit. You can see on the left-hand upper side of the screen that I have the black watered down to a bit of a thicker wash so that I'm not going directly onto the bee with the really thick, pure black paint, but I'm watering it down so that I can have a bit more shades of the black. So for the bee's head, that is the kind of a rounded half moon maybe shape with the black. And then the second area of black, I just filled in the area between the 2 yellow, the 2 first yellow blobs. And then for the third area of black, I'm filling in the area between those next 2 little yellow blobs and making sure that the bee is in a bit of a crescent shape, as that is what I was going for with these 2 bees. And then for the legs, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm using a size 0 or a size 2 round brush for details. Either one will work, whatever brush that you have that has the tiniest tip. I would use that for these details. For the antenna, I just did 2 little tiny swoops using the very tip of the brush. And then for the wings, I did a bit thicker line on the top of it where it has more of the pigment in that line. And then I created a lighter, more watered down shade of this black for the other part of the wing that comes down. The hardest part for me for these wings was making sure that I did not use too much pigment, that I was keeping them as light as I needed to be to look like they were insect wings. With watercolor, it's really easy to go darker or heavier in the paint. And one thing to remember with watercolor is to err on the side of lighter and more watered down, because you can always go back and make it darker, but sometimes it's difficult to pick that color back up with a paper towel and make it as light as you need it to be, especially if you're working with purples or blacks like we are here. For the second bee's wing, I did it in the same way, where the top line is a bit more intense of a black. There's a bit more pigment into that top line of the wing, that top swoop. And then the wing itself, I kept going back and lightening it up more and more with the paper towel, as I wanted to make sure it was a very, very light shade of gray. Then with the first bee that we worked on, I'm adding a bit of a darker part of wing, as if it's the second wing on the bee that's showing just a little bit underneath that first wing. And then going into the paper towel again, lightening it back up. And then putting in a bit of a darker black to where I thought the eye may be on the bee. Not necessary, I just like putting in the eye. The layings are just the tiniest little swoops of color, just really thin little lines. I tried to make them look a bit wavy, so they weren't just these, straight sticks poking out of the bees, but little wavy lines so that they looked like bee legs. And then again with that antenna, just the very teeny tiny tip of that brush, making two very thin antennae. And then putting in a little bit more of that black wash to make it look like there's a bit of shading on the bee, just on the underside of the bees. And then for a bit of shading or added detail to the yellow portion of the bees, I'm adding a bit of darker yellow. You can use orange. I believe I'm using the cadmium orange and yellow mixed together, but you can use a watered down orange or a darker yellow just to give it a bit of 3-dimension to the bee. Just a little bit of shading on the bees' bellies or the undersides of the bees. Then I go in with a little bit more orange, as the first layer didn't really show up a lot, so I'm just dabbing in and charging that color with just a little bit more of that orange. For the second bee, I'm going ahead and putting in the second wing. I thought it looked like we were seeing more of the back of the bee. Even though this bee is just from my imagination, I thought that it would look more correct, I guess, or it would look better if you could see the second wing as well. So again, I just did the thicker line and then the very light wash of gray. I think this is a good stopping point. I just love this painting of coneflowers and bees. I hope that you get a chance to create your own coneflower and bee painting. If you do, please let me know. I would love to hear about it. If you have any tips for me, please share them. And if you have any questions, please comment below. I hope to see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day.